Hello again, everyone, and welcome back to Reddit Aliens. I am John, and as always, thank you so much for being here. A good topic, let's do it. What's the scariest or most disturbing thing you have ever seen? Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. Anytime a child dies in the trauma room and we have to inform the family, who may be just arriving at the hospital or witnessing the whole rescue attempt, there's always a scream, a complete unraveling of a person or people whose lives have just been derailed. I never get used to the cries, but have to keep things moving after. I spent my childhood living with my grandparents in a rural house at the outskirts of a massive mountain in Peru. Our home was located in this huge grass plain with no people around. The nearest town was about 4 hours away from us. Basically the house of Courage the Cowardly Dog, the Andean version. There was a night where we all woken up by the loudest, high-pitched screams ever, and they were coming from outside our house. Our backyard, specifically. My grandparents grabbed some long knives and told me to stay behind them as they opened the back door. I was 6 years old, mind you. When they did, we saw 10 of our 20 alpacas jogging around the backyard, dripping from the neck down with blood, even the babies. My grandfather almost went mental until he realized the blood wasn't theirs. They weren't wailing or in pain, and the effing screams kept going. They came from the alpaca's shelter, where the other half was furiously jumping and stomping down their hay, even when something had ripped open the shelter's doors. The three of us walked to the shelter and scattered the pack away, and there we saw it. A mountain lion had descended by its own to the plain and managed to sneak through the wooden fence of our backyard. It had ripped out the shelter's basic lock with its teeth, and the unsettled animals went full stampede on it. The hay was the sack of skin and fur that remained of it, and its meat and organs were splattered on the shelter's walls. All the blood ended up in the animal's wool. We even found broken teeth, claws, and gum pieces stuck at their legs of the pregnant alpaca the day after. The animals had crushed the lion so badly, my grandfather could not even use its skin. It looked like a shattered rag. The birth of my daughter. My wife was very overdue and finally got induced 14-ish days late. Even then it was a struggle, and a C-section was not a good option because of scarring from a hernia operation she had due to celiac. She was in labor for 36 hours. At the end, there were frantic doctors and nurses running around, and I didn't know what was going on. They just pushed me away, and I could only stand and watch. Having 8 to 10 medical professionals urgently working on your wife and not knowing what is going on is literally one of the most frightening things I can imagine any expecting parent can go through. The umbilical cord was wrapped around my daughter's neck, and my wife's contractions weren't strong enough. They were using a vacuum and hoping that they wouldn't completely strangle my daughter in the process. They got her out, but she was blue and not moving or breathing. I could only watch. I was terrified and helpless, as was my wife. They got my daughter on a respirator immediately, and within 10 seconds got her breathing. Within a few minutes, you could see color. Even after she was conscious, she didn't cry. She's been tough from minute 1. We were warned about possible neurological damage. My daughter is deaf in one ear, but otherwise she's a very intelligent and very strong young girl. Being drunk as alone in the absolute pitch-black woods at night, walking home from a party, taking a shortcut, love it. I then, out of nowhere, started to get this unnerving feeling that I was being watched, that I couldn't quite shake for around 30 seconds straight before hearing the whistling of Twinkle Twinkle Little Star, somewhere very close to me. Now that shit sent a effing chill up my spine like nothing else before in my life, as despite hearing it almost as if the whistling was coming from right beside me. I couldn't make out where it was coming from due to how dark it was. I then bolted. No idea if that man was planning on harming me, but hearing that was something I'll never forget. I never take that stupid shortcut anymore at night. When I was in the 5th grade, I used to live with my grandparents in a very ghetto neighborhood, like a gun store next to a liquor store and various gang wannabe punks in every corner of the ghetto. My mother and I just got back from our school's student concert night, where the students have to sing various songs and such. Always hated it. Right when we got close, we heard a loud gunshot. This scared the crap out of my mother to the point where she swerved to the side abruptly. I myself was a bit unnerved by the sound and situation, but was naive and oblivious to what it all meant. When we got home, we saw our door with a bloodied handprint, and my mother booked it into the house. Inside was my uncle, lying down and bloodied with a gunshot wound around his left shoulder. I thought he was dead and started bawling my eyes out. He's like a second father to me. My mom rushed him to the hospital, and it turns out some thug tried to mug us, and my uncle tried to fend him off. When the thug shot him, he booked it out of the area. Luckily for my uncle, he didn't have any long-lasting side effects, and now has a pretty badass scar from the incident. When I was little, I was biking with my dad through a neighborhood a few blocks from our own. While we were riding, I lost my balance and fell off my bike, crashing into a mailbox and knocking it over. I felt terrible, and when the owner of the house, whose mailbox I had just plowed through, came out screaming at me, I felt worse. I tried to apologize. I even offered to fix it. The guy didn't care. He kept pushing me down, yelling swears at me that I had never heard before, given my age at the time. When I did get to my feet, he kept charging me, forcing me to give ground and pushing me every time he got within arm's reach. Then he started kicking me hard enough to knock the wind out of me. But what scared me the most were his eyes, angry, hateful, and pitiless. I honestly thought he was going to kill me. As I had raced ahead of my dad, he was just turning the corner onto the street at this point. He took one look at what was happening, and that was it. He ditched his bike, charged up the street, and started pummeling the man. No words, just fists. I sat there in pure shock as I watched my dad beat this psycho bloody. Neighbors called the cops and came out to the street, trying to break it up. By the end of it, the mailbox guy was a bloody incoherent mess. The whole time I sat there in silence, just trying to piece together some reason or cause for everything that had just occurred. In the end, my dad was let off with a warning. Most of the neighbors backed him up, as they had seen the mailbox psycho beating me around before they'd come out to help break things up. I vaguely remember a few trips to the police station after that, answering questions, pointing at the guy who'd beaten me. I remember hearing some neighbor tell me he'd moved away after the neighborhood committee kept harassing him. Some lady told me he won't hurt anyone again, sweetie. Still never forget it though. Those eyes still fucking scare me. It was the early 90s and I was about 6 years old. I was home on a very dreary and rainy day due to having an extremely high fever. And after an ice bath and fudgicle shoved into my mouth, Dad gave me a bottle of blue Powerade, and then I flopped down onto the beanbag in the living room. My parents had a bad habit of recording movies on VHS and not labeling them. Amidst my delirium, I decided to systematically go and rewind every blank VHS tape and play them from the beginning so that I could see the opening credits and label the movies with a silver Sharpie. This method worked very well for about 99% of all the unlabeled VHS tapes. It was great until I hit that one tape. Mind you, I had a fever of around 102 at the time. I rewind one more tape after doing like 60 already. I rewind it all the way like all the other ones. I push play, expecting to see opening credits, but all I see is a boy riding down the hallway on a tricycle. He goes up to a door that looks like a hotel room and seems very nervous about it. He then walks into the room and moves to the bathroom, where he then sees this decayed body of a woman in a bathtub. The boy then freaks out and runs to the hallway and shuts the door behind him, but doesn't realize that the door opens inward, not outwards. At this point, I'm very scared. And then at the peak of my suspense, the door opens and a green, moldy hand grabs the boy by his nape and drags him into the room. Oh, how I freaked out. I screamed and ran across the room and buried my face into the cushions of the couch. My parents were shocked and worried for a moment. Dad asked what happened as he walked out of the bedroom. I described what happened, and then he had a chuckle and said, "Oh, I see you found The Shining." But what really did it for me was a few moments later, after I had calmed down a bit, I went to the bathroom across the house, and my mom was in there beautifying her face. She was using that green paste that people put on their faces to tighten up their faces and make themselves look younger. So when I walked into the bathroom that I thought was unoccupied, after just seeing that scene from The Shining, my mom turned and looked at me with this sickly green paste all over her face and reached out to me to hug me. I screamed so hard that my voice broke, and all that could come out of me was just air. A slow, quiet hissing sound came from my throat, and I tried to run but couldn't move. I turned at the waist, but my feet were locked in place, literally paralyzed from the waist down, with my hands clawing at the door frame as I tried to desperately pull myself away from the impending doom. That was probably the most horrifying thing I've ever seen. Uncle, help me. My little brother's 4-year-old daughter called to me from the back deck. She had been cornered by an adult coyote. I charged through the screen door, scaring it away. That was the most afraid I've ever been. And I think I cried harder than she did. She'll be 30 in a few months, and at Christmas this year, she and her husband will introduce the family to their new son. Before she handed him to me, she whispered to him, "This one will always protect you." I think the scariest thing that I've ever seen was when I worked at a nursing home. We had a patient there for rehab, but she didn't want to go home to her husband and she refused treatment to get better. So, when her insurance ran out because she was just supposed to be there short term, she started to quit eating. And she was a diabetic after she refused her meds and then all the liquids. I don't know if this was her attempt at suicide or what, but she always said she couldn't go home to her husband. I was an 18-year-old CNA at the time. I didn't think about how maybe it was because he was abusive or whatnot. The last 8 hours of her life were on my shift. She spent it shaking and convulsing, and when she died, we went in to clean her before the coroner came for her. We closed her eyes and jaws. They'd been open, staring at the ceiling wide-eyed. We turned her in the bed to clean her, and we pulled her my way. Her eyes shot open, and some kind of bile shot out of her mouth and covered my scrubs. That face haunted my nightmares for weeks. Driving in a snowstorm going well below the speed limit, about 30-ish in a 55 zone. I've got 4-wheel drive, so I've been doing all right so far, but I was on high alert just in case. As I'm driving toward a set of train tracks, the lights go on and the arms go down. I gently push on the brakes and I don't stop. I push harder and I start to slide. When the train starts to pass, my foot is practically smashed against the brake pedal, but I still slide. I ended up stopping about 5 feet short of the train tracks. My front bumper actually hit the railroad crossing arm, but let me tell you, The terror of slowly sliding toward a moving train and not being able to stop is something. Today, on my first hunting trip, my cousin and I were trying to cross a frozen river, and he was testing the ice with the buttstock of his gun. He was shooting a 50 caliber muzzle loader. He leaned over his gun to hit it against the ice under him, and the gun went off and shot him in the chest. Whoa. I was right next to him, and within about 10 seconds, I had cut his shirt off and had shoved my beanie into the wound to apply pressure. I lifted his legs up and held him straight up to drain the blood into his torso while he was yelling, "I'm gonna die." His brother was about 100 feet away, so I yelled at him. He radioed his dad, who was about a quarter of a mile away, and rushed over to me. We called 911, and they had an officer at the top of a nearby road because we were in the middle of the forest. So, his brother ran to the top of the hill and got the officer, and I stayed on the phone with the 911 operator, describing the gunshot wound and giving location information. After about 5 minutes, his dad and the officer got to the scene, and we started working on him. We pretty much kept him stable until the fire department got there, and then they took over. They had to drag him up the hill through the forest and load him into an ambulance to drive him to hospital. It took about 2.5 hours to get him out of the forest and to the ambulance. We had like 20 dudes switching out carrying the stretchers uphill through the snow. He's alive but in the ICU. My adrenaline is still going, and that was more than 12 hours ago. The worst thing I ever heard, probably my sister's scream crying after seeing her best friend, she had a dog for a decade she grew up with, crushed by a car. Obviously, it wasn't a mother losing her child, though to her it was, but it was 100% the same sound. Of all the things I've heard in my entire life, I'll never forget that scream I heard as a young teen. Every time I hear a kid cry or some scream from a woman on TV or something, I immediately go back to that perpetuating scream I heard from my sister. I don't think I will ever hear a scream like that for the rest of my life. Craziest thing I've seen? Drunk as hell, the dude got tased twice and got the shit beat out of him from 3 cops while on the ground from being tased. Apparently he broke his girlfriend's ribs and knocked her out cold during the 911 call. So the cops must have seen it as fitting to tear his ass from Jupiter to Mars. The scariest, saddest thing I've ever seen. I once was visiting an old uncle at a rest home with my family. While I was there, standing in the hallway, some other old guy who could barely walk mistook me for his young son. He asked me why I've been gone for so long and asked to visit him and catch up. I visited him and ended up talking a little. I made up a story that I was gone because I joined the military and was recently released. He talked about my mother and how she would have been so proud of me and was always scared I would die a young man in jail or on drugs. I explained that I loved talking to him again but had to leave and would be back later. A few weeks later, my family gets a call that our uncle wasn't going to make it through the night. We go, and while we're walking, I walk across the old man's doorway and see the old man falling off his bed halfway, basically like when your right side is hanging off the bed. I wasn't sure if I should tell the nurse or fulfill my promise of revisiting him. I told my family I forgot something in my car and would be right back, then went to his room. I turned him over so he was on his back and noticed he was skinny as hell. You could see every last one of his ribs. For those of you not familiar with Alzheimer's, people who have the last stages of Alzheimer's can sometimes forget how to eat, let alone swallow. He was barely there, but he was able to talk. He started reaching behind his pillow, struggling to reach for something. He was too weak and had to give up. He looked me in the eyes, and his eyes were watering. I didn't know what he was looking for, but assumed it might be under the pillow. So I reached under the pillow for him and noticed I felt some type of paper. I guess it was some wrinkled note. I pulled the note from under the pillow and looked at it. I could barely read the letter, and it was far from legible, Basically, it looked like a 1-year-old had tried to write a short story. But I could still see it saying something like, "Dear son, Mom and Dad are so proud. Enter random cryptic sequence of letters. Live for love." I looked up, smiling. I was on my knees looking at the paper at the old guy, but all I saw was his mouth open and his glassy eyes staring into mine. No blinks, no words spoken, just his eyes staring 2 feet away into mine. I dropped the paper and knew immediately what I was seeing. He was dead. I notified the nurse that the man died and that he'd left a letter for his son. I guess on record it showed he had no living son. I gave my number to the nurse and asked her to give this to whatever family came to collect his belongings. Nobody ever called me, but I looked into the man because it got to me so deep and scared the shit out of me. I found that his wife had died in like the 60s, and his only son died not too long after in the Vietnam War. I don't know why he thought I was his son, and I don't know everything that was running through his fading mind when he tried to write the letter, but those glassy eyes staring into mine with his mouth falling open, I'll never forget it. The scariest thing I've ever seen was probably the sun. I was riding to school one day on a motorcycle. I had to make a right turn onto the street my school is on. I slowed down when I felt the most excruciating pain I've ever felt in my life. It felt like I was struck in the lower back with a sledgehammer. Everything I saw went black. I could feel wind rushing around me and the feeling of the ground hitting me along my right shoulder and arm. The next thing I remember seeing was the intense bright light. I remembered hearing that people who died saw a bright light. I felt so much fear. I didn't want to die. I was only 16 at the time, and as much as I wanted to say I was becoming an adult, all I wanted to see was my mother and father again. As the world around me came more into focus, I remember feeling cold and wet, and it felt like there was an arc in my spine, as if there was a wedge in my back, pushing it up. What I had seen was actually the sun shining over, in all irony, a chiropractor's office. I looked around. There were people standing around me, all manners of emotions, shock, pity, sadness, and one woman who looked horrified. But I think that was at herself because she kept apologizing to me. I started yelling that my phone was in my pocket, and I had to explain to the woman who called 911 that I wanted her to call my mother. She did, and soon enough a fire truck was next to me, and then an ambulance. And one thing led to another, and I was sent to Sick Kids. I was only 16 for emergency spinal surgery. I broke 3 vertebrae. Imagine what happens if you squish 3 Smarties. Rockets for the Americans. That's what happened to my T12, L1, and L2 vertebrae. I'm lucky I'm able to walk, and posterior dislocation from where I hit the ground. I also shattered my helmet, which only led to a concussion. I almost died in that intersection, and that thought and expense of those few minutes were the scariest thing I've ever seen in my entire life. Years ago, working in my hometown's downtown on my lunch break, minding my own business, I'd just gotten done getting a passport photo. Odd the details you remember. A man jumped off a parking garage as I walked by. He landed about 18 inches in front of me. One more step and he would have landed on me. The fall was at least 6 stories. It legitimately sounded like a bag of concrete hitting the ground. What still bothers me to this day were the noises he kept making. I would have figured dead on impact, but no. I very much doubt he recovered. But the whole time I'm on my phone, calling 911, he's making noises like he's trying to talk. So much blood came pouring out too, a puddle growing into the street. I remember everything he was wearing. Black leather jacket, Levi denim jeans, and Keen shoes. I wore Keens then too. But thankfully, he landed face down. I never saw his face. Very grateful for that. I was driving to my mom's for Thanksgiving after work. As I entered the access road and began speeding up to merge on the highway, a woman driving her daddy's red convertible Mustang decided she didn't want to go to a mind-numbingly slow 65 miles per hour. So, she tries to pass me on the right, by using the shoulder. I honestly don't remember if she ran out of the room or if she just wasn't paying attention, but she came over on top of me. In the split second of realizing that I was going to be hit, I had to make a decision. I could stand on my brakes at 65, risk losing control of my vehicle, and probably get hit anyway, or I could tap my brake to align my front tire with her rear tire, pull right ever so slightly, and let inertia and bad decisions run their course. I chose the latter, and it's probably why I'm still alive talking to you instead of getting pushed off the road into a concrete support beam at 65 miles per hour. But that isn't really the scary part. What was scary was seeing her car fishtail, slide sideways down the road, hit the curb, flat spin, hit the ground, and then roll several yards before finally coming to a stop upside down. It's been 10 years now, and that sequence is as clear to me as the day it happened. Play stupid games, win stupid prizes. But I didn't want to be the reason a family lost their daughter on Thanksgiving. Fortunately, she lived. Remember guys, nothing makes you more late than death. Please don't drive like this.